Today we pick up with chapter 21.1 and we're starting our discussion on poverty. In particular, let's focus on global poverty. The World Bank has stated that a third of the world's population lacks the barest of life's necessities. So what does that mean? We're talking about people being malnourished, poorly sheltered, minimally clothed, at risk for debilitating diseases, and low life expectancy. Now, in a rich nation like the United States, or any of the European nations, or Japan, or the other what are called, or used to be referred to as first world nations, or developed nations, these things, while they exist, are existing on a much, much smaller scale. But in many parts of the world, which are oftentimes referred to as the third world or the less developed world, these problems are endemic, meaning they happen to large bulks of the population. So let's first of all talk about poverty in the United States and come up with some numbers to illustrate what the scale of the problem is. Then we'll compare it to world poverty. So in the United States, we have a dollar number called the poverty threshold, and this is the government's definition of the annual amount of income that you need to have a to not be in poverty. So for the United States, that number in the year 2020 was about $26,000 per year for a family of four. And this number is adjusted annually for inflation, so that number will be higher today. Obviously, this is no longer 2020, and so the number gets adjusted each and every year. And the number is based on the underlying economic concept that families spend about a third of their income on food and other necessities, and the other two-thirds of your income goes to purchasing other things in your life. Not always necessities, of course, but two-thirds of your income go to other things than food. So if you map out what a minimally adequate diet is, go out and price it and figure out what it costs to have that minimally adequate diet, and then multiply that by 3. That's how the government has come up with, you need this amount of money in order not to be poor. Now, this threshold was adopted as part of what's called the War on Poverty. It's quite famous in the United States back in 1963 when President Johnson was first came into office. And he started what was known as the Great Society legislation. And there was multiple things were done in the 1960s, including the Medicare program for older people, and of course the poverty programs. And in the early years, for the first few years, we had pretty good success at reducing poverty, and the poverty rate came down, but now seems to have stabilized between 11 and 15%. Now, what do we mean by 11 to 15%? Well, during economic good times, when the economy is booming, as we've discussed already in the business cycle, there are good years in the economy. The poverty rate comes down toward 11%. When we're in a recession like the Great Recession, and lots of people are laid off, then that poverty rate creeps up to 15%, but it doesn't seem to come down below 11%, and it doesn't seem to go above 15%. So we seem to have found a stable band in the United States by, of course, the definition the government uses for poor. So in 2019, 34 million Americans were categorized as poor by this definition of being under $26,000 per year for a family of four. Now, there's some problems with actually counting poverty properly. When the government processes or calculates the poverty statistics, they're only counting cash income, but they're excluding what are called in-kind transfers. An in-kind transfer is the technical name economists have given to when government gives people something, but they don't give them money. For instance, if you give someone food stamps, and they can only use the food stamps to purchase food, that would be an example of an in-kind benefit. Medicaid, Medicare, those are hospitalizations for people who get sick who are either elderly or poor. And of course, you don't get a check from the government for $20,000 to go choose whether you want an operation or not. They don't give you the money and let you make your own decision. When you go to the hospital for a necessary operation, then the government pays for it. That's called an in-kind transfer. And the same thing would be true for rent subsidies, public housing, Section 8 housing, anywhere where a poor person is receiving a benefit from the government, but they don't receive it in cash to spend as they choose, but instead they are told you must use it on this apartment, then it becomes what's called an in-kind transfer. When you include all the in-kind transfers, then the poverty rate drops to the 8 to 10% level from the 11 to 15% level. So a few percentage points, but not to zero. So we still, even after these transfers, we have a poverty rate as defined by the government of roughly $26,000 for a family of four. We have between 8 to 10% of our population that falls below that standard. So next problem with measuring American poverty is we're using income measures. But income is not the only way that you have a living standard. Part of it is depending on your wealth level. Now remember, income and wealth are two different things, although they're highly related to each other. Income is the flow of money, like you get from your paycheck. Every month the money comes in. That would be an example of income. And then your wealth are the things you own. Houses, cars, boats, travel trailers, whatever that you have, stocks, bonds, anything of value that you own is your wealth. So herein lies the problem with our statistics. When you look at the families in poverty by the U.S. Definition, roughly 40% of those in poverty own their own homes. So what does it mean to say you're in poverty if you own your own house? Well, obviously we're talking about people whose cash income falls below the $26,000 level, but they're still doing pretty well. This could happen very easily. Actually, I think this number works pretty well for some of my in-laws, retired in-laws living in Georgia, over in Rome, Georgia, and their income in Social Security probably pretty close to $26,000, but they paid a house off over the years, and so they no longer have a house payment. Are they in poverty just because the government says they fall below the $26,000 level? Well, if you already own your house and you're not making a house payment, $26,000 may not be bad income at all if all you're doing is paying for food and groceries, right? So here, my whole point of this was to illustrate where problems exist in data collection. We do not collect data on people's assets. We only collect it on their income. It turns out that 70% of people who are in official poverty own their own car or truck. Again, what does it mean to say you're poor if you own a car or a truck? 30% of people in poverty have 2 vehicles or more. So again, I won't continue on hammering on this. The problem is, are we measuring poverty correctly when we only measure income? And of course, the answer must be no. We're not properly measuring whether someone is truly deficient with malnutrition and lack of clothes and things like that merely by looking at income. Because if you own all these things and you've paid them all off and now you're in retirement or something, and even if your Social Security check is small, you may still actually have quite a comfortable income. But the statistics don't show that because we don't calculate these things. We probably should. Now let's talk about, excuse me, let's talk about global poverty. Global poverty is a whole different level of issue than is American poverty. So let's go ahead and take a look at the issue. It's the word relative and absolute is really useful here. In America, poverty is relative, meaning that someone who is poor is only poor compared to even richer Americans. Absolute poverty means you're actually living in deprivation of actual goods and services that you don't have that you need biologically. Okay, so absolute deprivation is based on biological necessities. Relative poverty is based on, do you have as much as other people have? In other words, social necessities. The World Bank collects data on these issues and indicates that over 3/4 of the world's people live in nations where the average income is under $4,000 per year. The average income, not the poor people's income, the average, that would be the middle class income. These dollar numbers, by the way, because I know I always get this pushback from students, they're saying, oh, well, things don't cost as much in poor countries. No, these dollar numbers are adjusted for purchasing power before the World Bank reports them. So when we say an average income under $4,000, we mean what $4,000 would buy in the US. So 3/4 of the world's population lives on less than $4,000 a year. So clearly by the American definition, most of the world lives in poverty. But the World Bank does not consider that poverty because most of the people living in those countries don't consider living on $4,000 a year as poverty. So bottom line here is, by world standards, no American would be categorized as poor, or there might be some homeless people on the side of the road who have drug or alcohol problems, might fall under that categorization. But the vast majority of people who are listed by the government as being in poverty would not be considered poor by World Bank standards. Now, let's take a look at what the World Bank means by poverty. I mean, you'll be shocked at how poor major chunks of the world are. So there are two different definitions of poverty that the World Bank, that we're going to report on. The World Bank actually goes into way more detail on these things, but given the limited time we have, we're only spending one chapter on poverty. The World Bank defines two levels of poverty: extreme poverty and severe poverty. Extreme poverty is worse than severe poverty, but both of them are bad. Extreme poverty, income less than $1.90 per person per day. That is unbelievably low. 700 million people worldwide live on less than $1.90 per day. Now I have to let you know, I'm reading off of the slide right now. The $1.90 per day number has been changed for the reasons, as you probably suspect, inflation drives that number up. Because of, obviously, if rice and beans and basic necessities are getting more expensive in price, you can't just keep the $1.90 number forever. You have to adjust that number up to account for the cost of the things that poor people will buy. So right now it's around $2.15 per day. But we're going to use, because it's in the textbook, we're going to continue with the $1.90. I just want you to realize it's closer to around $2 per person per day. Now that's a very, very low standard. And that's why the World Bank calls it extreme poverty. But as you can see, 700 million people, or more than twice the entire population of the United States, live below this standard. Severe poverty would be income of less than $3.10 per person per day. Still an incredibly low amount of money. When you figure that would be, what, a 7-day week, each person gets $21 per week. For everything, food, clothing, shelter, everything has to be purchased for $21 per week. I don't think I've even been to Waffle House with my wife and gotten out of a single meal for less than $21 per day. I mean, per meal, let alone the other meals I had that day, plus the gas I bought, plus the things I've shopped at Costco for, plus, a middle-class American spends hundreds of dollars per day. Whereas if you're in severe poverty, it's $3.10 per day. 2 billion people live below this standard in the world. So the whole point of this is just to get a wake-up call to realize that when you live in an incredibly wealthy country like the United States, we consider $26,000 standard as to be the standard for poverty. Obviously, the World Bank has a very different standard, because when you look around the world, if you use the $26,000 standard, you'd basically say that the vast majority of people in the world are below poverty. And so that's why we have this different standard. Let's take a look at what COVID-19 did. These are some pretty surprising statistics. During the COVID-19 surge, an additional 71 million people fell into the extreme poverty definition. That's below the $1.90, or approximately $2 per person per day. 71 million people. That's a third of the population of the United States in size fell into that category, from being slightly above that category. And for some pretty obvious reasons. As you all know, when we did the lockdowns in the United States, not only were Americans thrown out of work, but don't forget, Americans import a lot of stuff. That means if we're not buying stuff from foreigners, because they're not allowed to come across, we can't ship stuff across the border during COVID, then people in third world nations that are producing these goods and services, the shirts we wear, the shoes we wear, things like that, I presume you all recognize when you look at the labels, there are many, many poor countries is where most of our clothing is made. Then, of course, obviously, those people start getting laid off. So COVID-19 not only hit the United States hard, but it hit third world nations dramatically harder. Because if you're starting off already at extreme poverty, rather at severe poverty, and then have a problem, you fall into extreme poverty.